same presentation in December for the statewide APR study group. And so this is actually the slides that they provided us for that session. And the way we worked it was I kind of went through the slides and then Jay jumped in with some real life examples. So I think that was really helpful. Jay does need to go at 1 for an executive committee meeting. So we're gonna let him go when he needs to go. And then if we need to stay on a little bit longer, I'm available to take us a little bit further. So as Pam mentioned last week, for those of you that were on the call, we went through the overview of RPIE. So we talked about strategic planning, what's involved in determining your problem statement, your goals, your audience, your messaging, your objectives, strategies, tactics. Today, we're going to do kind of a deep dive into research because that's an area that gets a lot of focus on the APR exam that a lot of individuals aren't necessarily as familiar with, especially if you've been out of school for a long time. So I'm going to briefly go through what we're going to cover, and then we're going to go deeper into each of these components. So as far as research and research methods, we're going to cover formal versus informal, qualitative versus quantitative, primary versus secondary, focus groups, in-depth interviews, intercept interviews, survey research, survey advantages, survey disadvantages, telephone surveys, mail surveys, and online and email surveys, population, sampling, confidence level, types of samples, non-probability samples, determining random sample size, and reporting survey results, content analysis, communication audit, public relations audit, research in the planning process, clarifying the problem, and the 7 parts to a research statement.
Hey.
So we're going to be identifying the types of research methods, advantages and disadvantages to these, and helping you become a little bit more familiar with research terminology because we're not scientists, we're PR people, right? So we want to utilize this for our purposes, but being familiar with the formalized processes. So formal research, that would be more scientific in nature. It uses the principles of scientific investigation, such as the rules of random sampling in surveys, in order to replicate results. If a sample's used and it is a true random sample, results can be projected to the larger universe. An example is a phone survey based on random sampling. You hear a lot about this with politics, right? Political surveys, a lot of times it's a phone survey and they call a sample of people that is a statistically valid sample, and then they project that out. So Jay, why don't you give us an example of when you used formal research?
Right, I think a couple of ideas around formal phone surveys. First, you have to be prepared for unintended consequences. And my favorite example of this is I worked actually with Jay Rayburn's team at Beacon Research when I was at Florida Tech back in the early 2000s. And we did a 425 person, I think, phone survey in a tri-county area. So we sampled Orange County, Brevard County, and Volusia County. And we asked a number of questions of the people who participated, trying to determine what they knew about Florida Institute of Technology, what programs they'd heard of, what their general sense of the institution was, that sort of thing. And so what we found was when we did the survey, more people knew and understood and celebrated our computer science program, for example, than knew we had a men's basketball program. And so this was quite a shock to both the president of the university at the time and the athletics director. And the surprise led the sports information office to be moved over to general communications and led us to doing a number of things, including advertising on the local ESPN radio station in Orlando, doing games with ESPN radio, hosting live remotes for like at opening night for the basketball practices, Midnight Madness and things like that. So a lot of changes come out of this kind of formal telephone survey research, and you have to be prepared for the unexpected. I can promise you, when we started the survey, we did not believe that more people would know about the computer science program than would know about the men's basketball program. And while we celebrated the fact that the computer science program was so well known, it did lead to changes, and pretty dramatic changes, in how we presented the athletics program in general and the men's basketball program in particular.
So that was an example of some formal research, and obviously was used to make some changes. Informal research or non-scientific research can look at values or qualities. It's more subjective. Informal research is good for pre-testing formal strategies. The findings of informal research cannot be projected to represent an entire audience or population. So examples would include personal interviews and focus groups. So Jay, give us an example of some informal research.
I think the best time to use focus groups is really the best tool you can use for developing messaging, communications messaging. You really get to dig deep into what does your organization stand for, how do the various publics view your mission and the impact of your organization. And if you're going to do focus groups, you have to, or in-depth interviews, you have to make sure that you get a fairly wide sampling of the population. So one example of this is I worked with the Sarasota Habitat for Humanity a few years ago to help them develop a campaign, a fundraising campaign. So I did focus groups with their board members, with staff members, with home buyers, and with community volunteers, people that come in and build houses with them. Trying to understand how each of those markets viewed the mission of the Sarasota Habitat for Humanity and how the Habitat for Humanity had made an impact in the community. And we came up, long story made short, we came up with a great campaign theme, which is so simplistic you would think that we could have come up with it without the research, but the research really pointed us in the right direction. And so we developed a Lives Transformed fundraising campaign for them, which so far to date has raised more than $5 million for homes in Sarasota County. So it's a great way to build your messaging and to really get an understanding of how very specific groups view your organization.
Qualitative research is somewhat subjective. It uses a problem or an open-ended free response format to investigate the value of programs or probe other questions, usually informal. And Jay's example with Habitat was just this type of research. They were trying to find out how people viewed their programs. Qualitative research is descriptive but not measurable. It looks at the how and why and yields an in-depth understanding of an issue, as he explained, and a focus group is a good way to do some qualitative research. Where quantitative research can be numerically stated or compared, and it uses statistical standards. It's highly objective and projectable. It uses close-end or forced choice questions. You're looking for factual, numerical questions with short responses that have precise, conclusive outcomes. Jay, do you have an example of some quantitative research?
In terms of the questions, I think at Florida Tech, we asked very basic questions. Have you heard of our men's basketball program? Yes, no, when we were at the USF Foundation, we are asking our donors. We did an online survey, and we asked donors very, tell us, would you like to read more about, and then we would give them options. So they had 3 or 4 options, but they couldn't just write a book to us and tell us all the different things they'd like to know more about. So in that way, we did close off their options. And a lot of times we do ask yes or no questions, or we ask them on a sliding scale. You've seen those kinds of questions. Not at all important, somewhat important, neutral, very important, or the most important thing ever, that 5-point scale. So those are the types of questions that are quantitative research questions. And that's what they mean by forced choice. We get something we can really measure over hundreds of people and then extrapolate that out to a general population.
Yeah, I think a lot about the 1 through 5 type questions, where then you can get a number, an average number, 4.5% of, was the rating. And then you can compare that if you improved or declined in future surveys on what the rating is of say a program, for instance. What did you think of your experience in our ER? And everybody gave it a 3. Well, our goal is to get them to a 5. So that gives you a starting point and an ending point for your quantitative research.
And when we did that research at USF, we asked the question, would you like to read more stories? Would you like to learn more about students who receive scholarships? And that would have been like a 4 or 5. And then we asked, do you want to read more about donors who have given donations? And that came in at like a 1.5. So we knew that the overall audience wanted to read more about the impact of giving and less about the people who actually made the gifts.
Primary research. This is research, an investigation of data that you're collecting firsthand or by a third party that you contract specifically for the firsthand party. So it's research that you do yourself that has not been done before. And it can be done by you or someone you hire on your behalf, but it is research that is being done by you, your organization, or a third party that you hire, versus secondary research, which uses the research findings of others. This is information that you collect secondhand. It's been previously conducted. This is usually the type of research that you would find that's pre-published studies. So you'd be finding something on the internet or in medical journals, for example, information collected by others that you are utilizing, but that you did not collect yourself. So now getting into kind of the types of, or the ways that you can conduct your research, and we do identify the types. So focus groups, which Jay talked about with his Habitat for Humanity example. These were informal primary research. They did them themselves, but it was informal. And the advantages were that it allows respondents to react to one another if they're in a group together. So you have a conference room full of people, or 10 people, 8 people around a table. The disadvantages are that there can be a high cost involved. It may require multiple sessions. The information's not statistically valid. So you're not using the scientific method. You can't extrapolate what the people in that focus group told you and say, well, this is how everyone feels, or this is how the majority of people feel, because it's only those people that were in the room. Usually you're collecting subjective information and it's not statistically reliable. However, it can be very valuable. In-depth interviews. These are also informal primary research. The advantages are that you have the ability to collect unobtrusive information. It's the best method for highly paid professionals and busy people. Disadvantages, it again can be expensive, slow to complete. You can have geographic limitations or access limitations. So this is where you're doing individual in-depth interviews versus having a focus group of people. Jay, do you have an example of an in-depth interview?
Sure. These usually are done in conjunction with focus groups. And to go back to the Sarasota Habitat example, I sat down with the chairman of their board and did a one-on-one in-depth interview. And I sat down with the executive director, the president of Habitat, and did a one-on-one in-depth interview. And the reason for that is, first of all, it's hard to get on their schedules. So you can't try to schedule them and then also schedule a focus group where you have 8 other people. The second reason is that a lot of times the people in the focus groups, like I did a staff focus group in that case, and I did a board focus group in that case, they may not feel like, those individuals may not feel like they can speak freely if they're talking in front of their boss or the chairman of the board. So this allows your focus group to be less inhibited, and it also gives you a chance to really dig deep with the people that are in charge. We did the same thing with the USF Foundation. We sat down with the chair of the board for the foundation, the chair of the board of governors, not board of governors, but their board of trustees for USF, and also with President Judy Ginshaft at the time. And again, a lot of the same reasons. It's hard to get on the calendar. And if you talk to them in a group of people, the group you're with will naturally feel exposed, and they're not going to want to be as open and honest with you as they might otherwise be.
So something to keep in mind for focus groups then is you probably want peer groups. And so you don't want to mix a lot of different levels in your focus group to where some individuals feel inhibited. So you could use the focus group for staff or the board. In-depth interviews for leadership might be the best way to go, just as an example. Intercept interviews, these are also informal and primary. These give you the advantage of being able to target a geographic location or demographic group, with the disadvantage being it's limited in length and scope. When I think of intercept interviews, I think of going back in time a little, when you used to go to the mall and someone would be standing inside the door at the mall, picture like, the 90s. And they'd have their little clipboard and they'd be asking you questions, right? As you're walking in the mall. Can I ask you a few questions about your experience with Bloomingdale Mall? Or can I ask you a few questions about what you think of the upcoming legislative agenda item that they're going to be discussing? Or what do you think about our school systems changing hours, or things like that, that they would just generally ask people at the mall? So that's how I remember intercept interviews. They're kind of cutting you off and grabbing you as you're walking through. Survey research. Okay, so survey research is one of the bigger ones that they focus on. This is a quantitative method that uses a series of written or oral questions to sample a desired population or universe, in other words, a group of people. The advantages are, if planned correctly, a survey makes it easy for people to participate. Participants can remain anonymous. The same questions can be asked in several ways throughout the survey to double check for accuracy and consistency. Disadvantages, people surveyed might not answer all the questions. People who respond may not be part of the universe you intended to sample. It's easy for people to give habitual responses. A low response rate is common. People can and do lie, and you can't test knowledge with mailed surveys. So they're really referring to like our written survey. So this is something you would probably receive in the mail, asking you questions about your experience at the Ford dealership and buying your car. And they want you to rate the salesman and rate the waiting area, and how was your service, and you're filling out some kind of a survey that you're then sending back. Jay, other examples of survey research?
Hey, Jennifer, this is Pam. Can I just jump in? We had a question actually on the chat.
Sure.
And so I may have, thrown this into the water here, but I actually had just posted that I posted on the chat about intercept interviews that if you visit Universal or Disney much, you may have been approached. They often have employees or cast members, as they want to call them, as you're exiting the parks conducting surveys. And so the question came up was, are intercept interviews ever known by another name or label, such as random interviews or on the spot interviews or such as that? You or Jay want to jump in and respond to that?
Potentially they could be called something different, but what we're calling them is what the APR study guide calls them. And that's what you need to know for the exam, is what's in the book. Okay, so other people may refer to them as different things, but for your purposes, for your exam, it's an intercept interview.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Jay, more survey? Anything else on surveys, written surveys?
I think that as time has gone on, you see less and less mailed surveys and more email surveys. I think SurveyMonkey in particular has given us a tool that most organizations can use in a cost-effective way that the old mail out surveys just couldn't match anymore. And so I think some of the disadvantages that you list here may not end up being as big a problem in the future. For example, people who respond may not be part of the university you intend to sample. Everyone should learn it because it is on the test. But I think in real life, the nice thing about email surveys is they do go directly. And so if you bought a Ford and you're not going to have an issue where maybe somebody's spouse fills out the survey and sends it in, even though they weren't part of the buying experience. Now with an email survey, it's much more targeted.
Telephone surveys based on random sampling are formal primary research. This is what the book says. The advantages are the speed of administration, no geographic limitations, accepted as an industry standard. Disadvantages, again, can be cost. Somebody has to make the call. Requires a professional phone bank, potentially, depending how many people you're calling. Limited in length and scope, and Jay gave his example of the telephone surveys that they did at Florida Tech. So those calls can take some time if you're having a conversation about the basketball team or the computer science program. So those can be some of the disadvantages, but they were obviously able to gain some really good information from their phone surveys and made some changes to their program as a result. I don't know why they have these so broken out, but mail surveys, we kind of talked about that under surveys in general, which I thought was the mail ones. Anyway, they can use rankings and comparisons. You can do message evaluations, convenient for the respondent. And well, I guess they're going to get into, the next slide is online email survey. So they're going to get into that separately. So this is just a printed mail survey on this slide that's being represented. Some of the disadvantages: time, labor, commitment. You got to open all those envelopes and type the data into an Excel sheet or however you're going to calculate it. Limited control, as Jay said, over who completes it. Maybe someone in the household who was not part of the experience might complete it. And costs can be high if response rates are low. So you're looking at the printing, the mailing it back, and then the time that can be involved in an actual mail survey. Whereas an online email survey, lower costs of administration. These are considered, sometimes more often informal, where the mail is more formal. I don't know why, but that's what the book says. And this is still primary research. You're doing it yourself. And these can be excellent for known populations with access to technology, which pretty much should be 80% or so of our population at this point. And you know, the disadvantages, they are best if you have their email address, obviously, and may be difficult to generalize to larger groups unless you have a big email database.
Let me jump in just for a second.
Yep.
So I see the question in the chat, and the answer is yes. The move to cell phones has made it more difficult to get phone surveys done. The belief in the business is that they are still as reliable as the old landline days. The difference is now with blocks and with people being able to see who's calling. You may wind up with people who are more interested in answering your call than you otherwise would have been in a purely random situation. And that's something that bears watching for the future. Whether or not that's something you can expect to talk about on the APR exam, I'm not sure. I'd rather doubt it. But as a practical matter, it is something that the industry is looking at. Secondly, most often informal versus the reason they are sliding this into most often informal is that usually with email, you have a audience already that has been targeted because these are people you have emails for. So they're already kind of in the tent. Whereas a pure phone survey should be people that you have no contact with otherwise, or if you do have contact with them, it's strictly a random occurrence that you do. You're not going after your own audience. So I think that is the difference why we see most often informal versus formal primary research.
Good, thank you for getting into that a little more. And again, as far as, you know, we talked about this a little bit last week too. There's practical, there's what you're going to actually do in the real world and how it impacts you, which is important to learn through all of this. But there's also what the book says and in preparing for the test, just being sure you separate that out. And some of the things from the book and from the exam, you know, maybe a couple of years behind what is actual function in our real world today, because things move so fast anymore. Okay, so now we're going to get into population and sampling and that kind of thing. So your population, these are the individuals whose opinions you are seeking in your survey. The population can be as broad as every adult in the United States or as focused as females who voted in the last election. The sample is drawn to reflect the population and is sometimes called the universe within your research. A sampling is a portion of the larger whole. So how large does your sample need to be? Well, that depends on how accurate you wish to be. Most scientific surveys aim at a margin of error of plus or minus 5%. Your confidence level, most scientific surveys aim at a reasonable confidence level of 95%. So if you did the same survey with the same audience 100 times, in 95 of them, the results would be similar to what you got the first time. A census is a 100% sample. So you're identifying all of the people in your population and giving each one an opportunity to respond. This is especially useful with a small, well-defined population. So if your universe is under 300, consider a census. A lot of times this is best if you're working with an internal audience like your staff. Probability samples, these are a scientific sample drawn in such a way that the probability of being chosen is equal or is known. So this would be like a random sample. A non-probability sample, which is an informal selection of persons to be interviewed. This would be convenience or an accidental sample. So this would be where you would drop by the cafeteria and ask questions of whoever's there. A quota sample. In a school, you find 10 elementary teachers, 10 middle school teachers, 10 high school teachers. A dimensional sample, you're identifying a specific number of male or female employees, et cetera. Any employee is okay as long as they fit the criteria. A snowball sample, you may know only a few users of a certain product, but they know other users. So you contact the first few and ask them for names of others and so on. A purpose sample for opinions of golfers, for example, you might hang out at the last hole to ask questions, or for a quick check of music lovers, you might hang out in the lobby before the symphony performs. And this is how you determine your random sample size. So this table, which is on page 39 in your study guide, does show the effect of sample size on accuracy in a random sample. So the illustration is for populations of 100,000 or above, where a random sample of 384 will yield a confidence level of 95% with a margin of error plus or minus 5%. And again, you saw a lot of this kind of data with the recent election, and they use this type of random sampling and probability. So if you wish to reduce your margin of error, you have to enlarge the sample substantially. So to achieve a plus or minus 4% margin, the sample must be nearly doubled from that 384 to 600. To lower the margin of error by another point to a plus or minus 3%, you must then go up to 1,000. So here's this chart again. And you can see that it really goes up. You go from 384 at 5% to 600 to 1,067 and so on. So it's going to involve a lot more people if you want a lower margin of error. So reducing the size of the sample below 384 raises the margin of error and makes the results less dependable. So if you did less than 384 people, you did say 150, you're only at an 8% plus or minus margin of error.
And just to think about that for a minute, if you're plus or minus 8% and you find that 25% like Labrador retrievers, that means anywhere from 33% of the population could like Labrador retrievers to 17% of the population could like Labrador retrievers. So you really would be playing with fire. You get that far of a spread. You don't really know anything at that point.
Because in fact, like 90% of the population loves Labrador retrievers.
Exactly.
Anything else, because I think the next slide goes on to something else. So anything more you want to add, Jay, about any of the sampling? All these definitions that we reviewed, these are all in your study guide. These are not common terminology, but these are things you need to know for the exam. They may ask you a question related to a snowball sample, for example, and you just have to have an awareness of what that is. They're definitely going to ask you questions about determining random sample size. So, be aware of that. I don't think you have to memorize this chart, but just be aware of that 5% 384. That's pretty key, and know that going up or down from that, you're going to be increasing or decreasing your sample size, but also increasing or decreasing your margin of error, which may give you faulty results that you're basing your program on. Any questions about any of that? This is the memorization part of the exam.
I would just say it's very important to understand primary, secondary, formal, informal, be able to know that terminology and how it lines up with the different types of research we're talking about. And I say that as someone who's written test questions for the APR exam.
In your study guide, basically page 30 to 32 kind of goes through the different methods and tells you what the book thinks, which is what you need to know for the exam, as to what a focus group is, whether it's formal, informal, the advantages, disadvantages. That's all outlined between page 30 and 32. Be very familiar with that and how they categorize each of those methods is what they call them. And the advantages, disadvantages, and applications. So that's an important section in your study guide. Okay, so reporting your survey results. So depending on the audience, you need to consider providing the following information when you report on your results: the dates when the interviews were conducted, the number of interviews and types, margin of error and confidence level, number of surveys mailed or emailed and returned. From there, you can do your content analysis, which is the objective, systematic, and quantitative description and evaluation of the content of the documents, including, oh wait, no, that's the wrong thing, sorry. That moved on to something else. I'm thinking you're analyzing your survey results. So when you are reporting your survey results, and you can include all of these components, and then when you discuss your results, you do want to include, your evaluation of the information that you received based on all the things we just discussed, the number of interviews and types, the information that you gleaned from that, and where you can go. Sorry about that, I jumped ahead too soon. So now they're moving on to something else entirely. So these are different types of research again now that we're going to discuss. What the APR study guide refers to as content analysis is a formal version of content analysis where you are doing objective, systematic, and quantitative description and evaluation of the content of documents, including print media and broadcast coverage. So this is, you're looking at your coverage from the media. In content analysis, you're looking to objectively code and describe the content of the communication. Content analysis involves selecting a unit of analysis, defining categories, sampling, and coding. I think we lost Jay. Jay, your camera is facing out into the kitchen.
Sorry, I had a little trouble.
No worries.
There.
So content analysis is considered informal primary research. Okay, so you're doing this yourself. You're looking at all of your media coverage. So it's pretty informal. Your advantages are relatively low cost, easy to replicate. Disadvantages include requiring careful definition of units of measurement, units of observation, and attributes coded. Content analysis can be useful to compare messages that appear in the media, such as TV versus newspaper. Also useful to study trends or changes in content in a medium over time. Jay, talk about a time that you used a media content analysis in some research, keeping in mind that a communications audit, according to the APR, is a different thing, and we're going to talk about that next.
Why don't we move on to the communications audit? Because I've not really done just content analysis on TV and newspapers.
Okay. So content analysis, again, just to be sure, is the objective, systemic, and quantitative description and evaluation of the content of documents, including print media and broadcast coverage, where your communications audit is a complete analysis of an organization's communication processes, both internal and external. So content is just the media. Communications audit is an overview of all of your communication processes. This is designed to reveal how an organization wants to be perceived by designated publics and what it is doing to foster that perception, and then looking at how it is actually perceived. So a communications audit is informal primary research. Advantages include assessing if your PR activities are in alignment with the organization's goals. Disadvantages, costly because it's labor intensive. Jay, thoughts on communications audit?
Sure. Well, I've done communications audits before, most recently for the University of Buffalo. And when you go in to do a communications audit, you really are looking at everything that is produced by an organization, whether that's social media, media relations work, the pitches and the press releases, annual reports, any kind of internal documents, any kind of internal newsletters. In this case, I was also working with the fundraising people. So I was looking at their cases for support, their fundraising proposals. And what you're really looking for in a communications audit is internal consistency with messaging to make sure that if you're saying one thing to one audience, you're saying the same thing to a different audience so that your messages are the same. And you're also looking, as it says here, whether or not your messaging matches the mission and the goals of the organization, what you're trying to accomplish. So it is labor intensive. And I think that ultimately, what you're looking for in a communications audit and in its close relative, the public relations audit, is are the messages you're sending being received in the way you think? And do those messages align with your organization's mission and vision?
Speaking of, the public relations audit involves a comprehensive study of the public relations position of an organization and how it stands in the opinion of its various publics. During a public relations audit, you do 4 things: identify relevant publics, determine standing with these publics, determine issues of concern to the publics, and assessing the power of the publics given size, etc. You're looking to find out what we think, interviews with key management, versus what they think, research with key publics, to determine how closely their views match that of company management. In essence, you're evaluating the disparity. You're looking at the differences between the we and the they, and you're going to be eventually recommending any kind of plan to correct the disparities and resolve problems that surfaced. So that's a little more targeted than a general communications audit. So content audit is looking at strictly what's published in the media. Communications audit is all of your internal and external messaging and how it aligns with business goals and mission. The PR audit, public relations audit, is looking at the differences between what your publics think versus what your internal organization thinks, or your PR department, or your executive suite thinks. So research in the planning process, as we talked a little bit about last week, you're starting with a question. Is there a problem or opportunity? What is that problem or opportunity? How do you know? Facts, guesswork, intuition. Do you need more facts? So this becomes the research phase, is defining that problem or opportunity that you're then going to utilize to develop your goals, objectives, etc. in your plan. So you're asking what will take us in the right direction? Who are your audiences and what do you want from them? So you're always thinking awareness, attitude, action, right? So that's what you're going to be measuring. So this is all part of the planning stage. And then you get into the doing, which is where most people in many projects start. So sometimes plans are prepared because there was only the perception of a problem or opportunity, but your research helps you determine, in fact, what that problem or opportunity is. It kind of helps you dig down past the symptoms to the actual problem. And in the end, always remembering to evaluate, did it work well? If so, how well? If not, why not? How do you know? Facts, estimates, intuition. Do you need to keep doing things? Do you need to do things differently? And your research helps you with that evaluation, because you go back to your research and you use the same techniques that you use to pinpoint the problem to evaluate the success of your program, of your plan. So organizations often seek a PR campaign to solve a fuzzy problem, such as we need a membership drive for the Alumni Association, we need more blood donors. But research can help you pinpoint why you don't have enough blood donors and how you can increase your chances of finding effective solutions, right? So not just we need more donors, but why don't we have donors now? And how can we increase our number of donors? So you're using effective solutions to try and solve that. So the 7 parts to your research statement, and we talked a little bit about this last week, it's kind of your situation analysis, right? So what is happening now? What is the source of concern? Where is it of concern? When is it a concern? Who does it involve or affect? How does it involve or affect them? Why does it concern the organization and its public? So those are some of the things you're asking as you're beginning your research to take you in the right direction. So then you know what kind of survey to use. Does it need to be primary research? Does it need to be, or could it be secondary research? Does it need to be formal or informal? How are you measuring? How are you going to use that information? Will take you to which method that you're going to use, and then help you further define your problem statement and write your plan. So they did provide us an example to kind of talk through. During the months of June, July, August, and December, demand for blood exceeds the blood bank supplies by approximately 100 units each month. The blood bank's inability to fulfill its supply mission causes critical blood shortages for emergencies at hospitals in the region, postponements of elective surgery, increased costs of transferring blood among hospitals, and diversion of staff away from donor recruitment and blood collection activities. So that's an example of a research statement based on, we need more blood donors. It's a lot more hardy, isn't it, when you're trying to develop a plan? So then based on the research statement, you can decide how you're going to ask questions, who you're going to ask your questions of. You're going to figure out why demand decreases during those specific months, because you know when it decreases. Is it because people are on vacation? Is it because people are more focused on the holidays? And then how you can reach that target audience to increase your donors during those months. Does that make sense to everyone? This depth of a research statement or a problem statement can help drive your planning. Any other thoughts, Mr. Wilson? I know you have to go in a couple minutes for your EC meeting.
No, I think that every client that I've worked with in the past, or any time that I've been doing this as an internal PR person, those questions, if not specifically the ones we asked, certainly get around what we were trying to learn and understand and why we started the research process to begin with. Of course, for the APR exam, we should probably know those questions by heart.
Any questions from the group? I can't see the chat because I'm sharing my screen, but Jay or Pam can jump in if questions pop up in the chat. Anything you want us to expound upon or give another example of?
There seems to be a consensus around Labrador retrievers. Beyond that, I don't see any new ads or new asks.
We have 2, by the way, Labrador retrievers.
Hey, Jay, this is Pam. You had mentioned that you have helped in the past to write some of the questions for the exams. So could you give not one that was approved that you know of, but could you give us an example of how, and
well, I think this was a few years ago, and my memory stretches back to breakfast, and that's about as far as I can remember anything. But I will tell you that the process is pretty straightforward. You have to write questions for the APR exam. You have to find them in the Cutler book. So every question we had to write had to come from the document that you're given to study with. So, and we had to be able to go back to it's called Understanding Public Relations. I'm blanking again because, memory is hard. But the Cutler book.
Cutlip,
Reference to
Cutlip and Center.
Yes, that one. Thank you. We had a reference to page. So it wasn't just we just came up with these questions. If we asked you a question about research and the question was along the lines of phone surveys are an example of primary formal, secondary informal, primary informal, etc. Giving you, because it's all multiple choice. Well, the answer is primary formal, and then we would have to, in writing it up, say that this answer can be found on page 95 of that textbook. So I just think that they do give you the tools to do well on the exam, but you really have to understand that every question is going to come out of that, or at least be referenced in that book.
Great, thank you. And I actually think the study guide does a really good section, a really good job on this section, because there are a lot of terminologies, and as Jay mentioned, they're also explained in the textbook. But really focus, make sure you read through this section of the study guide. Wouldn't you say, Jennifer, does a really, I think it does a really good job. They did it with the research methodologies, because there is a lot of definitions, a lot to understand. And Jennifer referenced the table on pages 30 to 32 in the study guide. And try to read the information first, then fill out the first page, because it actually goes through the methods. And then you have to identify, are they formal, informal, what primary, secondary, and what are the advantages, disadvantages. Try to do that first on your own before you actually read the answers, because they also supply the answers for you on that. So, read the material and then take a stab at it, because it is a lot of information to cover and to understand. But critical, because there are going to be a number of questions on research, both at the front end of the process and on the back end on the evaluation side. There will be a number of questions on the research side. And the only thing I would add, and Jennifer and Jay, you may have encountered this as well, that 384 number is a number that sticks in most PR people's minds coming out of the APR process from the research section. I don't know if it's because it's such a shocking number for all of us, if you weren't aware before, that you really only have to survey in a true random, statistically reliable survey, 384 people, to understand how and be able to extrapolate roughly what 95% of the population believes or thinks above a population of 100,000. But it is a number you will more than likely see on your exam. So look at the chart. All right, with that, does anybody have any other questions, Jennifer and Jay, regarding anything on RPIE? Questions about the exam going through this section? Have a quiet group today. I guess you either overwhelmed everybody with definitions, or we answered all their questions and everybody's very, very comfortable.
You know what percentage of people like chihuahuas by any chance?
No.
But we like ours.
Don't have a number on chihuahuas, but I'm sure it's also very high. All dogs are wonderful, as are cats for the cat people. I'm just a dog person.
And I could tell you're a PR person because you brought in the cats and gave them.
You have to. You got to love the cat people too. I have friends who are cat people. I love them, and it's all good. Pets are good for the soul. They're always happy to see you. Well, the dogs are anyway.
And there's a lot of research around that actually demonstrates how good having pets are for us. So
everybody went out and adopted pets over the last year, which is a happy thing for the shelters. I love to see all the pets have a home.
Yes, there's a lot of them that have been adopted. So, well, thank you, Jennifer and Jay. Thank you so much for Jennifer for last week and this week, and Jay for joining us this week. We really appreciate it. And I just want to mention real quick for everybody that next week we may be hearing a little bit about research and how it factors into issues around managing issues and crisis communications. And Rich Donnelly, APR, who is the immediate past president of the Orlando PRSA chapter, is going to give that presentation and facilitate that workshop for us. And of course, it's timely. Virtually all of us have been dealing with crisis communications in some way, shape, or form the last year. And so it'll be a very interesting and interactive workshop. I have no doubt about that. So hopefully we'll see everybody next Wednesday at noon to talk about managing issues and crisis communications.